welcome. TalkLife. I'm here with mental health champion Natasha Devon, who has done some incredible things over the years in mental health, including founding your own charity. Author, has been across multiple TV shows and doing some really incredible things for the mental health community, including speaking to hundreds of thousands of students across the UK and globally around mental health. So huge welcome. Joining on our couch today with Jen Russell, who's our clinical director at TalkLife. So I guess to kick things off, how did this all happen? A bit of your sort of back.
Good question. I don't know. How did it all happen? I now realise a type of anxiety disorder called panic disorder, which I've had since I was 10. That's something I've recognised in retrospect because I'm quite bad. I've had to learn how to express my emotions in a kind of timely and appropriate way. All through my teenage years, I was kind of swallowing them down, and of course that often manifests as panic. So I started doing that when I was 10, and then by the time I went to university, it had all got so unmanageable that I developed an eating disorder, which I recovered from when I was 25. And I remember thinking, I can't believe this has happened to me, because at the age of 25 I didn't have a job, so consequently I had no money. And I was living with my parents still, and this was back when you could move out, so that was far from ideal. And I remember thinking, if you look at my academic record on paper, it should be a success story. You know, I was a straight A student, and I realised as I'd gone through education, I'd sort of imbibed this belief that if you do well in your exams, you'll be successful and happy. So after I recovered from my eating disorder, I started thinking about mental health education and the way that we discuss mental health. And I realised that one of the keys to it is not to confine it to the quarter of the population that experience mental health issues, but instead make it universal in the same way physical health is. That was my aim. So I started going into schools researching in 2008, and then by 2010 it had got popular enough that I was able to do it as my full-time job, delivering these lessons in conjunction with experts, because I'm not a scientist, so I wanted to make sure I was getting the science right. And the things that we tackle in those classes are related to mental health, but they're not mental illnesses. So it's stuff like body image, exam stress, bullying, being LGBTQ, self-harm, you know, these everyday problems that young people encounter. And I've been doing that now for 12 years because I'm almost 38.
Wow.
It's hard to believe because I dress like a 3-year-old, but yeah, it's been a bit of it. Like, people always ask me, because now being an activist and a campaigner is a thing that a lot of young people want to get into. Quite often now when I go into schools, they say to me, can you give me some advice on how to get into this area? But it all happens so organically and accidentally. I never planned to be here, but I'm very glad I am.
It sounds like it was very much based around your own personal experience and wanting to help educate others off the back of that.
Yes, although say the lesson is an hour, I will spend maybe 10 minutes talking about my own story, just so that they know that I'm coming from a place of having lived it. Yeah. But what I didn't want to be was one of those people that did an awareness raising thing and it was interesting and engaging but wasn't relevant to the audience in terms of applying it to their life. So the way it's split up is a little bit about me, scientific stuff about how your brain works, and then I like everybody to leave with 3 tips on how they can apply what we've learned to their everyday life.
That's awesome. Have you found over the 12 years that it's that you've managed to maintain the same energy and enthusiasm, or is it sort of, it's a tough sector, isn't it?
Yes, so I change the lessons all the time. They evolve because science evolves. So I have a bank of neuroscientists, psychologists and psychiatrists that I consult with, and whenever they encounter a significant bit of new research, they'll get in touch and say, oh, now we think this, and I'm always reading. So I'll always try and input what I know into the classes to keep them fresh. But it has to be said that it is a challenge, like particularly at the end of the academic year, to deliver as though for the first time.
Yeah.
And because people always say, "Oh, you speak without notes," and I'm like, "Yes, because I've done it 20 million thousand times." Like, and so the key is to be kind of in the moment.
Yeah. Do you find it tougher getting through to teachers and sort of the hierarchy at schools or students, or is everyone sort of open to?
It's funny. By definition, the person that I deal with at the school is going to be lead pastoral, in charge of personal health and social education. So normally the teachers I meet are really into it, really into the message. The stories that I hear, because I have a weekly column in the Times Educational Supplement, so that's a way of me kind of reaching out to the education community. And sometimes they get in touch and say that they've had resistance from other members of staff that I wouldn't get to talk to. But my own personal experience is that teachers are frustrated by the lack of resources and the lack of funding, but really get why it's important.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult, isn't it, talking about mental health? Do people struggle to start having those conversations, or do you find that people kind of get straight into it?
I find this particular generation of young people that what are we on now? Generation Y? Generation X? We're near the end of the alphabet.
Yeah.
And this
what happens next?
That's the
Do we
beginning.
go back to
XA.
Yeah.
I don't want to be Generation A. That would be just
That'd be rubbish.
test tube.
Yeah. That's horrible. It's not catchy or cool. We'll think of something. That is the pressing question.
Yeah.
But this generation, whoever they are really open, really emotionally literate. I think the trick is with them, or the tricky thing is that they use quite a lot of clinical language in my experience, and they over-describe. So I remember a young woman I was speaking to a couple of weeks ago said, the way she phrased it was, she said, "My dad took his life, and as a result I am experiencing psychosis nightly, and I know that it's a coping mechanism because of the bereavement." And I was like, cool, but what is actually happening? And it turned out that she was having these really lucid dreams every night where her dad was telling her that it was her fault that he died. And she needed to cry, and she was using all this sophisticated language, I think, almost to cover up what was really going on with her.
Do you think we're quite quick to self-diagnose as well in this day and age, especially with access to the internet? Jump on Google and...
Yes. I think as well, so what my book is about is that we've got a very limited emotional vocabulary in English. We're very vague. So when you look at other languages, they get it so much better. Like, for example, German, they've got words like Schadenfreude, which means to take pleasure from someone else's misfortune, and that's a really specific word. In English, we don't really have words like that. So what that means is that anxiety is both a perfectly normal everyday thing, an understandable reaction to the sorts of things that we handle every day, but it's also something that can be unhelpful, and it's also a disorder. So if I say to you, I have anxiety, there's any number of potential meanings there, and I think a lot of people struggle with how do you know when you've tipped over the edge from what's normal towards worrying.
We were talking just before we started this about the global, how people describing things around the world is very similar, and that there's not these cultural barriers in mental health. And how do you find, sort of in your travels, especially across the UK, and do you hear how things are going in the US? And a lot of our users are over in the US. And
I do a lot of work in international schools, so you'll have sometimes 20, maybe even 30 different nationalities studying together.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is to ask the students about their cultural heritage and their families and how they deal with various things. I always assumed, and I don't know why, that the US would be more advanced than the UK, and yet the feedback that I get is that they're not. That maybe they're about 10 years behind in terms of awareness and normalization. Even because I think in my head, I think I've just watched too much American TV. I thought everyone's got a therapist and they're all totally cool with speaking about it. I got this mainly from Sex and the City, but apparently that's not the case.
Yeah.
It's true, isn't it? Because we get that impression that in the US you guys are amazing at talking about how you feel and you're much more open, and us Brits are kind of stiff upper lip, no, we're fine. But actually maybe that's not the case.
Yeah, or maybe it just manifests slightly differently. Like I last year I went to Nepal, which was an incredible experience in many, many different ways. But I remember talking to people just in shops and stuff, and in the everyday interactions thinking everyone is so chill. And I was thinking maybe they know a secret that we don't know in the UK, and I thought I must find it out before I leave, export this chilledness. And then when I was working with the pupils in the school, they, particularly the young men, were saying there's a real taboo about expressing any sort of anger.
Okay.
And the teachers were telling me that there was quite a lot of problems around self-harm, because obviously that anger has nowhere to go. It's going to kind of internalize. And the way that they phrased the question to me, they were saying, can you help me? Because sometimes I feel angry. And I was like, oh, of course you do. You're human. We all feel angry sometimes. It wasn't help me to express the anger in a healthy way. It was, can you help me not to express it? And so that made me sort of redefine that. I was thinking, everyone that I interacted with, they want to tell me to F off. But they couldn't, because there was a taboo
Got this
around
anger
it.
inside.
Yeah, I got such anger. Yeah.
You should do some anonymous note taking after this. Over the 12 years, you've had some sort of interesting moments, and one of them that I was and it's in your book as well, you talk about writing a page, the boy-girl moment, which I found just hilarious. Look it up after, if you haven't. How did that make you feel? I mean, did that kind of make you feel like we were back in, like, 10 years ago? Or should I set the background for it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so moving into, you were speaking at a school and you talked about students not using the genders boy or girl, and that kind of blew up, and people didn't really understand why, and you were quite criticised.
Yeah, this is the thing. So the media is so binary, and whenever now I see a headline that is about something being banned, I immediately don't believe it, because in reality very few things get banned outright, But what I actually said was that when you're talking to a group of pupils, even if you're in a single sex environment, rather than saying hello girls or hello boys, say hello everyone, just because that's the most inclusive way. And it's such a simple switch as well.
Yeah.
But somehow that got interpreted as I was advising teachers to ban the words boy and girl, and just,
Frustrating?
So frustrating, because I don't mind if people want to challenge me on things I've actually said. That's fine. But when it's a false premise, it makes me really angry and frustrated. And when you're the centre of particularly on social media, the centre of a storm, it's really difficult to respond rather than react.
Yeah.
So I found that I was saying things that I wasn't particularly proud of as well, and looking back going, I should have just remained calm, but it's difficult, when you're in that situation.
It's so hard.
Because social media brings a whole new dynamic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not just to kind of how we interact and how news is spread, but also how we seek support and how we kind of reach out and talk about ourselves.
Yeah. Well, as well, I think, so the more information you have, I think the more overwhelming and confusing the world becomes. And there are kind of two ways that you can go with that. You can either reconcile yourself to the idea that you're always going to feel a little bit overwhelmed and that loads of things are a mystery. Or you can go, no, I'm going to find a really simple binary narrative and just repeat that regardless of all the evidence.
Until I can get all caps and like, increase the font size.
Yeah, so I just feel like social media should have made us more intelligent, but in fact has made a lot of people less intelligent, because it's split them into these very extreme tribes that just shout at each other. Like, Twitter is just people shouting now.
Yeah, it's a great place for an argument, isn't it?
I find the flat earthers thing incredible, a great example of that. That you've kind of got the wisdom of the masses, and you've just got this big crowd saying exactly the same thing. And even when it's proven like that, the Earth is round, TalkLife, but yet it's still just, that can't be true because I belong in this crowd, and that's so dangerous when you sort of go along with something, even though when you know that the facts are something completely different.
Yes, and also we've had this what's called the footballification of politics as well, where it doesn't matter how right the person is or the content of what they're saying, it's what team do they belong to, and that defines whether or not I get on board with what they're saying.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see what's going to happen over the next 10 years with that, especially in politics.
Yeah.
You talk about banning. How did you feel about the Instagram move last week with the banning of self-harm? I know we've talked about it a few times with different people, and I think it's a really fascinating decision.
Yeah, I mean, by definition, it's got to be an algorithm, hasn't it? So what I would be interested to know is whether that algorithm is sophisticated enough to determine whether somebody is speaking about self-harm in a helpful way or an unhelpful way. I mean, I'm sure they've sorted that out, but we haven't seen yet. And I think it is tricky with self-harm because I would say it's fairly unique within mental ill health in that there is a contagion element. People are always scared of talking about depression, suicide, and I don't think, particularly if you follow the charity guidelines, I don't think that you can talk someone into any of those things. But self-harm it's a symptom, so and you don't know what people are going through. So to talk about self-harm in a very behavioural way, talk about what people do, and to show images of that are very graphic, I think is something that needs to be addressed. So I'm glad that Instagram have at least acknowledged that, but it does need to be quite subtle and sophisticated the way they do it.
Yeah.
What do you think is a healthy way of talking about self-harm?
Well, the way I do it is I talk about broadly coping strategies, and I say, whatever you do when you get home after a stressful day, you close the door, you're on your own. Whatever you did to take the edge off, that's your go-to coping strategy. And objectively, however good or bad that is, it's giving you something that you need. So if you're drinking to excess, rather than going, I want to stop drinking, think, what is this giving me that I need? And is there a better way that I could get the same things? So with self-harm, it's endorphin producing. It's a form of self-expression for a lot of people. It's distraction for a lot of people. Those are things that they obviously need. Can I get those things in another way? So we talk about understanding what your trigger is, how long it takes to conquer a craving, being able to distract yourself with something else for that 20 minutes so that the urge to self-harm hopefully starts to dissipate, and then servicing those needs in a way that isn't as destructive as self-harm.
That's a really good way of thinking about it. I think sometimes when you start from kind of where you are and recognizing, right, this is how I'm feeling and this is how I'm behaving, and rather than trying to force yourself to be different, to actually think, well, how can I move on from this point, but first to recognize how I got here.
Yeah, and I actually, a friend of mine wrote a brilliant book. She's called Sharu Izadi. She wrote a book called The Kindness Method, which is exactly that so often we berate ourselves because we've developed habits that we think are wrong, but there's a reason why we started doing that in the first place.
Yeah, I love that way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Can we go through some TalkLife posts?
Yes, please.
I've seen some amazing questions and comments put up, and so if I'll dive into.
We asked the community today, so it's Eating Disorder Awareness Week this week. So I popped a post up earlier asking people if they had any questions that they wanted to ask about eating disorders, if there was anything that they wished people would know about eating disorders, and just kind of what conversational points they'd be interested in. And we've had some really good responses. One of the main ones that kind of came through a couple of times was, how do I know when my eating has gone from kind of being a problem, being normal, to being a problem? Like, when is that definition of, oh, I've got an eating disorder now?
That's a really good question, because it's almost socially defined. So I went to a lecture by Susie Orbach once, who wrote Fat as a Feminist Issue, and she was saying 30 years ago, if someone had come into my office and said, I've cut out a whole food group, I would have diagnosed that person with an eating disorder. Yet now that's advocated in fashion magazines by lifestyle bloggers. So it's what is normal is constantly shifting and changing. I would say it's about how much distress it's causing you, how much of your time you spend thinking about it, and to what extent it is interfering with your ability to function. That those are the things that would indicate that you might be kind of in disordered territory.
Okay.
Emily wrote, I've had anorexia since 12, 13. I'm turning 18 next month. Is it possible to get better after years of living with an eating disorder? Because it just gets worse and worse. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I can understand where that question's coming from, because is it Emily?
Emily.
Yeah, if Emily's had it since she was 12 or 13, what she doesn't have is a blueprint for adult life outside of anorexia. And that's what she will discover. It is possible to recover. I find that recovery is an ongoing process, particularly if you've had anorexia for, 5 or 6 years. There's going to be days where there's a bit of a dip. But again, in my book, I say recovery is a bit like knitting. Which is a really down with the kids example, but
I think knitting's coming back.
Oh, is it? Brilliant. So when you're knitting, sometimes you drop a stitch, but that doesn't mean you haven't already knit the row. So recovery is, it's not like one day you wake up and you're completely free of it, but you will get to a point where it will be less omnipresent, it will be less painful, and it's taking up this much of your headspace instead of this much of your headspace.
I love that. Sometimes you drop a stitch, but you still on the road. That's amazing.
Yeah.
But you're an example as well of someone who's battled yourself with an eating disorder and come out the other side.
Yeah, and I would say that I live alongside mental health issues in the same way as I would if I had diabetes, a long-term physical health problem. It's there, and some days are better than others, but it doesn't define who I am as a person.
Cupid wrote, great username. Why do most people think this doesn't affect males, and how do we raise awareness for the fact that it does? Good question. Some follow-on questions, but I think that's the...
Well, there's been some great campaign work in this area actually over in the UK. There was a guy called Sam Thomas who founded a charity called Men Get Eating Disorders Too, and it's now called something like the Male Eating Disorder Network. It's changed its name. But one of the great campaign outcomes he had was that up until very recently, it was technically impossible to receive a diagnosis of anorexia if you were a man, because one of the primary diagnostic criteria was your periods had to have stopped. And obviously, if you're a man, your periods can't stop, unless you're a transgender man. So it was just impossible to get that diagnosis. So we are starting to recognise that this is something that affects men more. In my experience, the journey happens more often in reverse with men to how it happens with women. So with men, it's more likely to start with compulsive exercise and then branch out into restriction of food. Whereas with women, it's more often restriction of food that then develops into compulsive exercise habits as well. So I think we just knowing that and having that on your radar is a good way of being able to see it in the men around you.
Yeah. We have an incredible ambassador as well, the sci-fi author, who's done some great stuff on that as well. I'll link that up later on as well. A really cool blog there for men as well. Polar Boss. I'm going to skip that question. Christian Gator. I suffered with an eating disorder, and I didn't realise until long after I gained 100 pounds in less than a year, and now I'm struggling with how to lose it. What I'm concerned with is the fact that it can be difficult for other people to know, and I'm afraid that people will find out.
Yeah, it's. I think. First of all, one of the things that I do is I write down my network, and then I write down, so say I've got a money worry, I have my little network that I can talk to you about that. Say I have a friendship issue or a mental health issue, and I write down the names of the people that I would approach to talk about that, and then what response I'm going to get from them, because some days you need tough love, and some days you need somebody to give you a cuddle and stroke your hair and tell you that you're fabulous. And that way, I've got my kind of, I call it the tree of trust. I've got my tree of trust,
I like it.
of people that I can talk to about those things. I think so often when we talk about kind of going public with a mental health issue, we think that we have to kind of go ta-da, to everyone.
Yeah.
But it does, to start with just one trusted person and get a compassionate response, I think then gives you the confidence to talk about it and, do it at your own pace. I would say as well that if you see the disordered eating as a symptom, and think about why you're doing it. If you talk about feelings, everyone can relate to that. If you talk about behaviours, you alienate certain people.
That's a really good point. So really focus on the feelings so that everyone can relate to the same things. How about if someone is talking about their eating disorder for the first time? Have you got any tips for someone who has never spoken about it before, and perhaps those closest to them aren't aware?
Yeah, there is a lot of shame, and in fact, I noticed that I find it a lot easier to talk about anxiety than I do about my eating disorder. It's still I get that, because I think a lot of people believe that it's their own fault and that they could stop if they wanted to, and that's because eating disorders get conflated with diets all the time. I would say, first of all, think about what you want from your friends. What would you like the outcome to be? Would you like them to check in with you every day? Do you want them to help you with certain difficult situations where, are there things that you find particularly distressing? What do you want the outcome to be? Because what people really love is feeling like they're proactively helping. So if you say, like, can you help me with this? Can you be my person that helps me with this? That helps the other person to feel useful. I would also say be prepared for some unhelpful responses, and realize that that's not your fault. Like, particularly if you're a woman with an eating disorder, you tell people and they go, oh yeah, I've had that for a month when I was 16, and you go, okay. You just have to go, okay, you're not the right person to talk to about this, and try someone else.
Yeah, I think you have to be really careful with having that group of friends that you go to. And you mentioned tough love, and do you think there is a place? Whenever we talk about tough love, there's sort of these massive camps where people say you can't have tough love. It doesn't belong within mental health. And sometimes you actually, for me, I need someone to come alongside me and say, yeah, actually, what you're doing is crap, or this, and destructive. And do you think there's a place? Okay, obviously.
I have this radical theory that people are different, and that different people need different things. But
it's a radical.
Yeah, I know, it's really radical. But also that we might need a different approach at different times. And sometimes when I'm talking to young people, I tell them about my parents, because I'm exactly halfway between my mum and my dad. My mum's very warm, like she just wants to give the world a cuddle, and my dad has absolutely no time for any nonsense whatsoever. So a lot of people say that being friends with me is like being given a hug and a slap at the same time. And I realised that there are some days where if I have a problem, I go to my mum and she says, let's have a cup of tea and a slice of cake and talk about this endlessly, and I'll tell you that sounds horrible and that everything that you've done is right and understandable, and that's what I need. And then sometimes I need my dad to say, why are you even thinking about that? Stop overthinking everything. Go outside and play with the dog.
Maybe.
And the dog's at the door just like, good choice.
But maybe it's about those people who are going to give you the tough love being people you trust.
Yeah.
So it's very different if you don't know the person and they're just kind of jumping on and saying, you need to feel differently.
Yeah, you're
but actually,
right.
if it's within a trusted circle, then you know that person's got your best interests at heart.
Yeah, they're coming from a good place.
Yeah.
Do we have time for two more? I think. Little star. I'd like to know how to handle anorexic people that are proud or starving and ruining their body. So it's Yeah, let's keep it to that first part. I'd like to know how to handle people that are...
It is difficult. I would say, first of all, try not to take it personally because it's their illness talking, not them. And it does require a lot of patience. Eating disorders, I would say, in particular, if you know someone with an eating disorder, they do require a lot of patience because the pathology of it is, there's a lot of kind of believing that you're special and that you have more willpower and all it's just annoying things, but it's part of the pathology of the illness, and you have to separate that out from your friend. I would say the best thing that you can do for somebody with an eating disorder is to remind them of life outside of their illness. So take the things you know about them, what's their sense of humour, what do they enjoy doing, and try and keep them connected to those aspects of themselves. And that way you are stopping the illness from absorbing them. You know?
Yeah, that's good.
Can I chip in? Have I got time to ask another question?
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody who is really battling with their eating right now? And do you have any tips on how they can get support or what they can do to help themselves?
I'll come in with that question as well. With finishing with Tina's question, can I get better on my own? I've been keeping this problem a secret from my family, and I can't tell them. So I think it leads into. But I guess for all of the sort of million people that are at TalkLife that are just starting to think about talking about it for the very first time, well, where should they start?
Well, I would say the first thing is please don't Google it, because there are millions of people on the internet and at least half of them are idiots. So you will get
maybe 3/4.
You will get a lot of misinformation, people trying to sell you snake oil. You might even end up in a pro-anorexia forum, So make sure you're getting your information from a trusted source. On my website, natashadevon.com, there is a page called Advice and Support, and there's about 12 charities on there that will give you safe, evidence-based advice.
Nice.
And one of them is Beat, which is specifically where I'd encourage people to go for information on eating disorders. They also have a helpline. I don't know if it's possible to recover by yourself because I don't know anybody who has done that. I would imagine that it would definitely be a lot harder. One of the things that you could try is, say you go onto Beat's website and you find a page that you think, oh, that's useful, that explains it in a really good way. Print it off and leave it somewhere for your family member to read, just for them to go, oh, okay, oh, I didn't know that. So you're almost like teaching them about the illness, giving them a little bit of context, so that hopefully you can get to a point where you can talk about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Beat is international, aren't they? They do some.
Their website is available everywhere.
Yeah. Otherwise, we can find some other versions as well. I know there's some amazing spots in the US. But the book, A Beginner's Guide to
Being Mental.
You can grab this on Audible as well, and Google Play.
I can read it to you.
That's exactly what you want. You should grab this. It's really cool. If you're not reading anything at the moment, if you want to switch from watching YouTube videos or something at night, grab this. It's really easy to read, and thank you so much for joining us on the couch. We're going to give some copies of this away as well, so I'm sure if you leave some comments down below, we'll send you out a copy. And
Do you have them here?
We don't. We have this one.
I was going to say I will sign them.
Amazing. We'll
get
have
some
a
signed copies, which is incredible. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Hope you're all having a good day.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.